You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another Top 10. Been a fat minute since I've done a Top 10 video, and at the start of this one, I recently held a poll as to whether or not I should include short stories in this, or just do novels. I had thought about doing another poll just to see if people wanted me to also include nonfiction, but decided against it and will just be doing my top 10 favorite fiction books in this video. And maybe we'll do nonfiction later on down the road, we'll see how it goes. With that in mind, today we will be talking about my top 10 favorite books, specifically fiction books. As you can see, the poll did say to include short stories, so that's what we're doing, which is kind of what I hoped for, because it's easier to make the top 10 that way for me, to be perfectly honest. Though I did prepare a top 10 list for both scenarios. Also, one bit of criteria, I'm only allowing one book per franchise. However, I'm not including the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft as a franchise, so there are a couple entries from that on here, because I don't necessarily think that would really count as a franchise. Definitely a shared, expanded universe, but I think that the stories themselves are self-contained enough that that doesn't matter. But anyway, let's jump in. So, number 10, we have Halo 3 Contact Harvest. This is one of the Halo novels, and it's my personal favorite of the bunch. It's a story that follows a young Sergeant Johnson dealing with the first Covenant invasion. At the time, Johnson was not yet as high of a rank, but he was training a bunch of cadets on Harvest when the Covenant invaded, and he had to deal with a bunch of untrained cadets and use them to fight against a Covenant invasion. This book also expands on a lot of cool stuff, like it expands on the training. When they don't use live rounds, they use these bullets that lock up your armor and basically put you out of commission temporarily. So I do think that's really interesting, the way they do their training. But overall, I really like this book because I really like Sergeant Johnson. An honorable mention here, since I'm only including one per franchise, would be Halo the Flood, which is a great story as well, and gives you some insight into what it's like to be turned into a Flood combat form. Another good honorable mention would be Halo First Strike, which takes place between Halo 1 and 2. And another one would, of course, be Halo The Fall of Reach, which is an iconic prequel to Halo. But Contact Harvest, I do feel, is the best of the Halo books, in my opinion, personally. Keep in mind, I haven't read absolutely every single one. But I really like it quite a bit. I really like Sergeant Johnson, and I like the story. Number 9, Fight Club. Now, Fight Club is one of those weird cases where I actually think the movie is considerably better than the book. That said, I still like the book quite a bit. Fight Club, for those of you unfamiliar, is a story about an everyman who doesn't have a given name in the story. His nickname among the fan base is typically Jack, based on some lines from the movie that were actually changed, because in the book it was originally Joe. In the different expressions like I am Joe's sadness, stuff like that. But they made it Jack in the movie, so that's kind of why he has the nickname Jack. They actually call him Jack in the Fight Club PS2 game, which is an awful game, by the way. Also in Fight Club 2, which is a graphic novel, they call him Sebastian, and he has many fake names that he goes through in both the movie and the book. That said, even though I do prefer the movie, the book is still really good. That said, the story is Jack is this everyman who has insomnia, is going to all these various support groups to, like, try and feel some sort of comfort and help him sleep. He meets this guy named Tyler Durden while he's traveling. He actually meets him in a different way in the book than he does in the movie. In the book, he meets him on a nude beach, whereas in the movie, he meets him on an airplane. There's also a bunch of little differences here and there, like Tyler actually kills people at one point in the book. As with the movie, the homoeroticism is definitely there. I always think people overplay that when they talk about Fight Club. I definitely see what people are talking about, but I do think that's a little bit overplayed amongst the fan base and criticism of it. Other than that, the book does have a lot of interesting things that aren't in the movie, such as the aforementioned murder, which is staged as a play, and they kill his old boss. And it's really interesting. It's been a while since I've read the book, but I did quite enjoy it, though I do once again prefer the movie. I won't spoil the twist. There is a twist at the ending, but I will say, story-wise, Jack joins up with Tyler Durden. They form a fight club, so an underground fighting ring. And then that devolves into this crazy, over-the-top, violent, almost terroristic thing called Project Mayhem, where they're going around doing all sorts of crazy stuff. It's a great story, and I highly recommend checking it out, though I would recommend the movie over the book. Number 8, Star Wars Death Troopers. This is the only Star Wars book on this list. An honorable mention would be the Old Republic Revan, which is great as well. But Death Troopers I felt was just a bit better, because it's fucking great. Death Troopers is a very creepy horror story set in the Star Wars universe. It's set amongst this prison ship that gets besieged by a zombie virus. And here's the thing, I'm not the biggest fan of zombie fiction because a lot of it I find repetitive, but the atmosphere, the build-up, the tension, and the suspense are so well done in this story. It's genuinely terrifying, and I absolutely loved every second of it. There's also a great twist later on in the book, because there's a couple characters that are in solitary confinement. I won't spoil what the twist is, but it does involve those characters in solitary confinement, so it's a really interesting twist from that point on. This book also makes references to a lot of memes amongst the fan base. I'm not going to get into too much detail, because if I mention what particular memes, there could be potential spoilers that people could put two and two together there, and I absolutely want people to read this book. The first time I actually read, quote-unquote, Death Troopers was actually listening to an audiobook, and the audiobook, much like the audiobook I heard of 1984, has a bunch of like sound effects and music and other things when it transitions. It didn't have multiple voice actors, and it wasn't done by the same guy. This was a professionally done, officially released audiobook. Still really well done. Probably one of my favorite audiobooks I've ever listened to. Great story. Absolutely loved it. Number 7, Of Mice and Men. Now, Of Mice and Men is a classic story that you always read in high school, typically. Or at least that's been my experience and the experience of many others I've known. And you read it for high school English class. It's about these two guys named George and Lenny moving from place to place because something always inevitably goes wrong where they are, and they're constantly scheming and trying to get ahead in life. George is the smooth talker, very manipulative, but also very caring towards Lenny. Lenny's a big, not very intelligent, lovable lug that tags along with him and doesn't know his own strength. They have a dream of one day starting a farm together and having rabbits, and Lenny gets to pet the rabbits, and ultimately this story does not end well for them. Great ending, but it's very sad. I won't spoil it here once again, but I do absolutely think that Of Mice and Men is great and worth checking out. There's also a pretty decent movie adaptation of it as well, which I also would recommend. And it's actually based off a poem, the title is, where the poem itself mentions that the plans of mice and men don't go according to plan or don't end well, something like that. It was in German, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it translates to something along those lines. But yeah, very good story. I absolutely loved it. Very sad. Number 6, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. So this is the second book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. And it's based off the second radio series, with the exception of the beginning, which takes place at Milliways, the restaurant at the end of the universe, which is where it gets its title, because in the radio series, Milliways was actually in the first radio series, but then they moved it to the second book for the novel adaptation. This is by Douglas Adams. It's, again, very comedic. It's my favorite of the books and my favorite of the radio series. It has the total perspective vortex in it, which Zaphod goes through. It's also the most Zaphod-centric of the arcs in the story, so that's one thing I really liked about it. If you're familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know who Zaphod is. He's my personal favorite character. It's a great story, lots of crazy stuff happens, and then they just kind of retcon it in the third radio series and third book, and then act like the events didn't happen, even though they reference it later on. It's a little bit confusing with that, and then it's kind of revealed at least in the radio series, to be another universe. I can't remember if they did that in the books or not. But overall, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe is my favorite of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. It's a fun sci-fi comedy, and it is a fun book and fun radio series. It'd be great if there were other adaptations, but who's to say if that'll ever happen. Anyway, let's move on. Number 5, The Call of Cthulhu. So this is the first H.P. Lovecraft entry in the video, and it is, in my opinion, the most overrated Lovecraft story. Though there is a reason it gets its hype, and I do still quite like it. As far as Lovecraft's actual works go, Call of Cthulhu would be third for me. If you're unfamiliar, it's this horror story about this boat that's going out and just kind of gets lost, and people go out and they find it and the crew's completely vanished. Then they find this island, and there's a bunch of stuff about Cthulhu. There's these dreams. Cthulhu's this giant squid-type monster who's this god from another dimension or space. Basically what happens is they find this island, and then Cthulhu ultimately gets unleashed on the world. It's kind of left ambiguous as to what happens there, but ultimately it's supposed to spell our doom. It's Lovecraft. It's his most iconic monster. There's a reason it's so popular. But I do personally think it's not his best story. I think there's a few that he's done better. But ultimately, the Call of Cthulhu is still really good. It's creepy. When they find the missing ship and all the weird anomalies about it, that's really creepy. And then, of course, Cthulhu himself is iconic. Not to mention the nightmares they have and the clay idol that's found. So there's plenty of interesting stuff going for it. There's the weird cult in the swamp. Very good story overall, and there's definitely a reason it gets recommended as much as it does, and there's a reason it's Lovecraft's most well-known. Moving on to number 4, we have The Trial by Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka is a very interesting writer in that he didn't finish a lot of his books, yet they still got published later on after his death. The Trial is one of those. There is a jump in the story where several chapters are missing because he didn't get to complete the story, so you gotta kind of fill in the gaps yourself. That said, The Trial is a very interesting and fun anti-authoritarian story about this guy that gets arrested without knowing what he's been arrested for. He's just told he's arrested. They don't tell him he has to stay home or anything. They just let him know, hey, just so you know, you're under arrest. But as it goes on, the law becomes very clearly to be absurd and not understood by the general population in this story. He's under arrest. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know what that entails. And he's just going on his way to try and fight it. It ultimately, again, is a commentary on authoritarianism, unnecessary bureaucracy, and the absolute joke that the legal system is. Things do get progressively worse for the protagonist as his case goes on, and he keeps reaching out to different people for help. Lawyers are also kind of shifty in this universe, with the way that they treat some of their clients. For instance, the lawyer has this other client by the name of Block that he treats like absolute shit and makes him grovel just to get attention. It's a very interesting and bleak story. I like it quite a bit, and there's also a pretty decent movie adaptation by Orson Welles that has Anthony Perkins in it, and I'd recommend checking that out as well. But yeah, that's The Trial. It's really good. I would highly recommend it. Number 3. At the Mountains of Madness. This is the second H.P. Lovecraft story on the list, and it is my second favorite Lovecraft story. At the Mountains of Madness is a great story where this expedition goes out into Antarctica and finds these ruins that have this hieroglyph that tells the story of this ancient war between the Elder Things and the Old Ones, which are both these ancient deities that come from space. And it ultimately describes this war and just how dangerous it is for humanity. They also find a dead Elder Thing within down there. There's also these really weird giant penguins in there. It's really creepy and atmospheric, and it's interesting with a lot of the imagery it has. Guillermo del Toro was going to do a movie adaptation of this story at one point, but then never got around to it, which is a damn shame. Guillermo del Toro is a great director, and I would have loved to see his interpretation of At the Mountains of Madness, because again, it's my second favorite Lovecraft story, and he actually almost burned it. Lovecraft thought it wasn't good enough, because when he tried to submit it to Weird Tales, he was told it was too long, which to him was his way of saying that they were letting him down easily, and he thought that they were just trying to not hurt his feelings, and he thought it was terrible. Especially since he put the most amount of work into this one. It destroyed him, and he almost burnt it, along with his other story, which is my personal favorite, that we'll get to in just a minute here. So we'll hold that off for now. He almost destroyed it, which would have been a damn shame, and I'm glad he didn't. I think one of his friends and co-writers, I can't remember his name, I think it was like August Derleth or something, actually talked him out of burning it. And thank God he did, because the world would suck without it, because it's one of his best work. Again, At the Mountains of Madness, great Lovecraft story, great creepy imagery. It gives you an idea of sort of the hierarchy of the Elder Things versus the Great Old Ones, and kind of gives you an idea that there are these other deities out there that we are hopeless in comparison against. Very interesting story, I absolutely love it. Number 2. The Shadow over Innsmouth. The Shadow over Innsmouth is the final Lovecraft story on this list, and it is my all-time favorite H.P. Lovecraft story. It's my favorite short story overall. It is about a town called Innsmouth that is known to have this taint, where the people of Innsmouth just seem to be dark and evil and twisted. They don't like outsiders. There's a cult there, known as the Esoteric Order of Dagon, that runs the town. And ultimately, many members, if not all the members, of the Esoteric Order of Dagon and of the town are actually fishmen. And we're put into the shoes of a reporter who's going and investigating the town. He's going around following up on it, trying to figure out what's going on here, and ultimately just ends up in this trap where he's just kind of left in this town where everybody hates him, wants him dead, and he's just kind of, stepping on eggshells, trying not to alert anyone. Ultimately, it doesn't end well for him. I won't spoil the ending. It has a great ending, though. But the imagery of Innsmouth as this weird seaside town that's creepy and hates outsiders is great, and that's why I love the adaptations that have come from it, such as the video game Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, which is a great game, by the way. And Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth does expand on it quite a bit, but it's a very good story, very creepy, and I love the imagery of it. It's my favorite Lovecraft story, personally, and I do think it is better than Call of Cthulhu or Mountains of Madness. It was also almost destroyed because Lovecraft himself was insecure about it. But again, thank God that didn't happen. Number 1. 1984. Now, 1984, if you've seen my review of it, should be no surprise that it is my number 1 favorite book. 1984 is an amazing dystopian novel about an authoritarian regime known only as the Party, run by an enigmatic figure known as Big Brother, who is constantly watching you, monitors the way you act, talk, and think, and they have these things called telescreens that are constantly spying on you and watching for any abnormalities in your behavior, because if you're committing thought crime, that's what matters to them. It's not the action that's a problem in 1984, it's the thought. It's any thought of rebellion or abnormality that they must quash. They rewrite history and destroy the old versions of it and then act like the new versions have always been there. They have something called the Ministry of Truth, where they destroy old books and then reprint them with their new narrative and then redistribute them to act like they are, in fact, the old books unaltered. And using something they call doublethink, everyone just accepts that it's always been like that. It takes place in a superstate known as Oceania, which is always either at war with a place called East Asia or a place called Eurasia, which are the two other superstates, because only those 3 superstates exist. And they just keep changing who they're at war at, but say they've always been at war with whichever one they are currently at war at. It's a great story. I did a whole review of it. There's an audiobook of it done by this guy named Steve Parker Audiobooks. I'd recommend checking that out, as I said in my review. There's been actually 4 screen adaptations. I've only seen 3 of them. I've seen the 1954 version, the 1956 version, and the 1984 version. There is actually an older one from 1953 that was done as part of a series called Studio One. So I want to check that out at some point, because that's the only version I haven't seen that's been adapted. But it's a great story. Very bleak, very depressing, very dystopian, and again, as an anti-authoritarian, it is absolutely my favorite book. I love the story, I love the message. It's a bleak warning of the future, basically showing just how dangerous it can get when you let authority abuse its power and overreach, and just shows how bleak things can get. It has many things that have entered into common phraseology, such as Big Brother, doublethink, Ministry of Love, thought crime. Many phrases have entered into our common vocabulary because of this story, because it's so impactful. It's my personal favorite dystopian story, it's my favorite novel, and George Orwell wrote a hell of a bleak vision for the future, but you know what? It's scary just how right he might end up being. But yeah, that's my top 10 favorite books. Didn't dwell on it for too long. I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Have a good one. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Toodles.